Okay, thank you, comrades. The Russian Revolution kicked off by women on International Women's Day, and I just want to read a bit about what they did, because they came out onto the street, some on strike, some just marching for bread. But the day before, some of the women who worked in the trams went to see the soldiers in the barracks to say, we're going to come out on International Women's Day, please don't shoot us, you know. And then they did come out on International Women's Day, and they started marching, and I'll just read a bit from eyewitness reports about what they said. The women marched through the streets. The slogans they were chanting as they marched made it clear that their strike was about more than the lack of wages and food. Down with the war, down with high prices, down with hunger. That's what they chanted. And then the women, driven to desperation by starvation and war, came along like a hurricane that destroys everything in its path with the violence of the elemental force. This revolutionary march of working women, full of hatred of the centuries of oppression, was the spark that set alight the flame of the February Revolution. That's how it started, and I just want to go back a bit to give a bit of a context, because exciting as it was and inspirational as it was, it didn't come out of nowhere, but it did come out of a whole period leading up to 1917 of war. First World War started in 1914, and all that went with it: the hunger, the killing, the injury, the dislocation, and the disillusionment that the war brought. Really, really acute. So just to go back and talk about a bit, to try and put it into context, because Russia in 1917 only happened because of the start of what happened in 1914, because the world around this period was a pressure cooker of inter-imperialist rivalry and competition, and it led to a war, the First World War. And that First World War, all of the so-called socialist parties that said workers of the world unite, we will oppose any war, they capitulated and become nationalists and supported their own country in the war. Apart from a few people across the world, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, their party in Russia, we had John McCain in Scotland, the Irish guy, James Connolly, and in Germany, Liebknecht, Clara Zetkin, and Rosa Luxemburg opposed the war, and a few others. And this was a horrendous catastrophe politically. But the beginning of the war in 1914, many people, working people, volunteered to join and fight. Others were conscripted, and at the beginning it wasn't going to last long, but it did last. It went on and on and on, and it brought greater and greater death, injury, and destruction. But while this was going on, the rich were getting richer. We've seen that before today. In Russia, the Tsar's court, the princesses and the ladies in waiting said that they'd never had so many diamonds, and never had there been so wonderful, dresses and everything. While the women who did the work, or the women that were peasants, were in real difficulty and literally starving. The Russian society, the Russian, it was an empire. It was mainly peasants, but it was, and had in it, advanced capitalist production. There was uneven and combined development economically that had, say, in Petrograd, or St. Petersburg as it was, real big industrial complexes with international, investment and real high state-of-the-art machinery producing steel and stuff that was exported around the world. But then in other parts of Russia, you had a backwardness, peasants using wooden ploughs, so it was very uneven. But Russia and the Russian economy was part of the world economy. And the world economy, that in this inter-imperialist rivalry, went into severe crisis. Hello, come on in. Good to see you. Hiya. See you again. Welcome. Yeah, should we shut the door now? Yeah. That's great. So I'm just introducing a discussion about the Russian Revolution, how the war that went on from 1914 for years and years caused about mass suffering, there was hunger and starvation, and then there was a rebellion that was kicked off by women on International Women's Day in February 1917. So I just want to sort of say, what was the whole thing, the Russian Revolution? Trotsky puts it in his fantastic History of the Russian Revolution, that what we saw was the forcible entry of the masses into the realm of history to decide their own destiny. It wasn't that everyone was a subject and told what to do by their higher-ups. The people themselves had an uprising, collective resistance, and in the end that brought about a change in the world. At this time, just before 1917, there were three big empires: Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and there was a war that was going on from 1914. The Russian Revolution destroyed all of those three empires and stopped the war. The First World War didn't just end, it was ended by the people rebelling and saying we won't have a war anymore. And when I say the Russian Revolution of 1917, actually there were two revolutions. There was a revolution in February, there was a revolution in October, and revolution isn't just one occurrence, it's a complex, contradictory political process which it can go forward and backward and forward and backward, and there can be problems and solutions and arguments. It's a process. So I said that the women started it, and then on International Women's Day in February, they had riots over bread, they had striking women workers come out, and the Tsar, the autocratic Tsar, sent in the Cossacks. It's like the SAS, you know. They're going to sort them out. And they didn't disobey orders, they went out into the streets on their horses, but they went through and amongst the women, and the women went amongst them, and they fraternalised. This was a sign that revolution was, in the air, if that was going on. So the Russian Revolution starts in February, and I want to talk about February to October, which is not long, actually. In terms of revolutionary process, that was a long period, a lot happened. And I want to go through some of the main things, but I'm going to miss stuff out, and that's, you can have many meetings on all different aspects of this. So the revolution starts in February, and the women are the spark. There's big protests and strikes, the strikes spread and spread and spread. The army refuses to put down and shoot against the people, and then you had a revolution outcome, and you had the setting up once again of what were called Russian workers' councils, or Soviets, that had been invented and developed in the dress rehearsal for the revolution in 1905. And it was basically, if you're on strike, you send strikers or a delegation to have a meeting, and they form a group and talk about what they're going to do, how they're going to run the strike, how they're going to take the revolution forward, and that became an alternative source of power. There was dual power after February. There was the old regime with the Tsar and all his ministers, and there was and the state that they had, the Russian state, the Tsar, and then there was a new organ of workers' power, the Soviets. Now, in March 1917, a provisional new government was set up out of and in support of the revolution, led by Kerensky, a provisional government that the revolutionary socialists in the Bolshevik Party at first said, oh, we'll support that. But it was led by rich people. It was not led by women workers or strikers. They were the figurehead of the revolution. The Kerensky government, but they delivered on none of the promises to give food, to end the war, or anything else. And in April Lenin, who was the leader of the political party, the Bolsheviks, he was in exile and had been for years, and he came back and arrived back in Russia in April 1917, and he was cheered when he got off the train, and he goes, no cheering, you're all wrong. And it's like, what? And what he was saying was that the political program, the political ideas, the political understanding that Lenin's party had, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, was this. First of all, we've got to kick out the Tsar. And then afterwards, we can set up a sort of democratic type society, and then we can fight for socialism. It was like 2 stages. We're going to have a democratic revolution before the socialist revolution. Now, there was a political activist leader, Leon Trotsky, had written a political theory about this, and he said that the revolution doesn't have to be in 2 separate stages. It can be a revolution in permanence, that the fight against one aspect of the society can grow over into a bigger struggle. And Lenin agreed with this. He hadn't agreed with it when Trotsky said it, but he agreed after seeing what was going on in Russia, and he came back with an April thesis, and he talks about rearming the party. Not with guns, they needed guns, but they had guns because they'd all been soldiers. Rearming politically about what we're fighting for, so that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had clarity about what to do. He had to have an argument within his own party to get this position. In June, the revolutionaries in the most advanced parts of Russia, in the cities, they started, especially in Petrograd, they came out and have a demonstration, and we'll bring our guns with us, and we're going to start the revolution now. Now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had an argument with them. Said, whoa, no, don't go out on the streets and make a revolution now. Why not? Because the rest of Russia are not ready for revolution. We've got to, if you start a revolution, it's got to go all over, and therefore we need more preparation to explain to people that revolution is coming and we need it, but not now. We need to patiently explain to people the necessity of revolution and how it would work. Now, in August 1917, the Western powers, especially Britain and France, they were absolutely horrified. They started a revolution in Russia. They could do one here in Britain. They could do one in France. Oh my God, we're going to go and drown that revolution in blood. And they armed and financed a General Kornilov, and he got an army together, a counter-revolutionary army. And his aim was to march on Petrograd, the centre of the revolution, and kill all the revolutionaries, whether they were right-wing, left-wing, moderate, or whatever, to drown the revolution in blood. Now, Trotsky, who was in jail, put in jail by the Kerensky government at the time, was released from jail, and he came out of jail, and he discussed with the other comrades and said, what we need to do is to unite in a united front of everyone who wants to defend the revolution. We'll link arms and stand together, and we'll oppose this Kornilov. And they did do that, and that was a real application of the united front. It was successful. Kornilov couldn't get his soldiers and his troops into drown the revolution in blood because the railway workers changed all the tracks, and they just couldn't, it's like, I've got an army, yeah, but you don't know how to drive a train, do you? So the workers' state that was being formed and the workers' power successfully held back Kornilov. Now, Trotsky at the end of the summer joins Lenin's party, the Bolshevik party, and then the situation becomes more and more contradictory and more intense, and the discussions are, we've got to have a revolution, a second revolution, to get rid of this Kerensky administration and those that aren't serious, and we've got to have a more thorough revolution that will completely turn upside down society, and we want to have an outcome where the working class are in the saddle and in power. And Lenin said, what we should do then is we should organise an insurrection, and we should do it as the Bolshevik party. And Trotsky disagreed and had an argument, and they discussed it out. And Trotsky said, if you seize power by the party, it will not be seen as for the whole of the revolutionary movement. It will not be the whole of Russian society. So Trotsky won an argument that the insurrection should be organised by the body of the workers' councils, by the workers' sort of Soviets, as they were, and part of those workers' Soviets, if you got a picket line and scabs or former police officers or whatever going to attack it, you have to defend it. And so there was what they called a military revolutionary committee, and that was the body that organised and took through the insurrection in October 1917. So February was the first revolution, October was the second revolution. And at this time, Lenin was trying to understand these massive changes in this revolutionary process, and he wrote a really important pamphlet, State and Revolution, at which he concludes that the existing state, the bourgeois state, with its Tsarist officers, the Tsarist army, the police, the courts, the judiciary, all of that, which was part of a state, you can't just get hold of it and we'll run the police better, or we'll run the army better. All of that state has to be done away with, and we need a new way of organising society, a worker state, and a worker state would have a people's army, or the Red Army is what they set up. There would be revolutionary courts as an alternative to the Tsarist courts, and all aspects of running industry and society would be run anew by revolutionaries in the interest of the revolution. So what that was about was understanding that in the politics of reformism, they said, well, if we get elected, we could then run the system better. But the system's not able to be run better because it's rigged, in the sense that it's a system based on competition with other capitals, and that's what drove it to war, and that's what drives the rich to get richer and the poor poorer. So we need to do that and set up a new state, a worker state. And that is what was set up in October 1917. And this was a fantastic beacon, and Lenin wanted this state. The aim was, can we last as in Russia, as a worker state, can we survive as long in time as they did at the Paris Commune? And the workers' state did last longer than that, and it was more successful. But the other thing I want to say about the revolution is that I described the revolutionary process in Russia that went from February, to October 1917. But what happened in Russia? It wasn't like there was a revolution over there and everyone else was quiet. The whole of Europe was aflame with revolt, rebellion, revolution and uprisings. It started in Ireland with the Easter Rising, the first outburst of rebellion against what had been going on in the war. There was in Britain in 1919 the biggest strike wave we've ever had. Britain was the nearest, it was called on the brink of revolution. The Brits, they sent army trucks and tanks to Scotland and to Liverpool to try and suppress the uprising in 1919. In Italy, started in 1919, 1920, there were 2 years, they called them the Piena Rossa, the red years, of strikes, of occupations, of the factories, very, very militant rebellion. In Germany, when the Russian soldiers were at the front in 1917, they were fraternising with the other soldiers in the other armies, because nobody wanted to fight and kill each other, So when the revolution happened in 1917 in Russia, and then it was clear that without Russia in the war could no longer be carried on, and the German soldiers came back home to Berlin with their guns from the front, and they didn't go back to barracks. They went onto the streets with their guns and joined the revolutionary marches and what was going on, the German Revolution, and then that brought down the German sort of king, as it was the Kaiser, and there was the beginning of the revolution in Germany. In France, there was mutinies across the French army. In America, they knew about what was going on in Russia. There was general strikes in all sorts of cities across America in 1919 with the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblers and others being involved. In Seattle, there was a general strike in that town. And then within the Russian Empire, because there's Russia, but Russia had an empire like Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, a whole number. They were all part of Russia, and those national countries that had been oppressed in the prison house of nations that was the Tsarist Empire, they started to say, well, we want some of our own, we want more freedom for ourselves. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks had a political policy of granting independence to different nations if they wanted to be independent, you know, whether it was Hungary or Poland or anywhere else. And so there was national uprisings. Now, I've probably missed some countries out actually, but there was a revolutionary uprising. But what I want to do though is then to conclude, which I think I need to do, is I tried to explain that year 1917, the dynamic of the revolutionary process during that year, and also pointed to a whole wave of revolutionary uprisings in countries all across Europe that happened. But there was only one place where the revolutionary process went all the way and brought about an end to the old society and the birth of a new. A society, what the revolutionaries in Russia did, they turned the world upside down. So those that used to be at the top were no longer, and those that were poor or oppressed were now, at the top. The biggest example of that probably is Leon Trotsky, who was Jew. The racism inside Russia was absolutely vicious against the Jews. There was pogroms, they could only live in certain places, they couldn't work in certain areas. But Trotsky becomes the leader of the socialists in the Soviets and also the leader of the Red Army. Women made the biggest gains in the revolution that acted as a festival of the oppressed. They were given immediately the right to divorce, the right to contraception. There was no more laws making it illegal in terms of abortion. It was called homosexuality then. The laws against homosexuality were done away with, and then you had people who were for the first time openly gay in, this is 1917, 1918. All religious minorities were being oppressed. You can have your own religious courts, you can practice your religion any way you want. Languages that weren't allowed to be spoken, you can speak your own languages, you can have schools where you speak in whatever language you are, whether it was Ukrainian or Yiddish or there was many different languages across the Russian Empire. But the Festival of the Oppressed also extended and reached individual people. And there was an absolute flowering of art. Everywhere was painted with all this graffiti, music that used to be only the Tsarist court could listen to the classical music. It started playing classical music and opera inside factories and taking it out to the communities where people lived. And people loved it and wanted it because they could see for the first time that there was human liberation, emancipation was possible, not only economically and politically, but in terms of how it affected people personally. Lots of people split up with their partners and went off with new ones. Others stayed there where they're really happy or whatever. I'll just give one little example about this, if I can, about women in the courts. The religious groups was you can have your own court. So if a woman wanted to get divorced, she wouldn't go to the religious court. She'd go to the Soviet court. I want to be divorced. That's it, you're divorced. If she didn't want to be divorced, she just wanted to be treated better, maybe have a bit more money, she'd go to the religious court and say, my husband, he treated me bad. And they would rule, you've got to treat him better. So, that was sort of trying to make it a bit concrete how these things actually worked. So, The Russian Revolution, the forcible entry of the masses into the realm of history to decide their own destiny. That's what happened, that's what it was. It was a fessor of the oppressed because there was a flowering of all sorts of liberationary sentiment in art, in music, in culture. It was part of an international wave of revolutionary struggle across the whole of Europe that had been devastated by war and famine and the greed of and could see the greed of the rich who were getting richer. But although there were revolutionary uprisings in many other places, there was only one place where the revolution, the October type revolution, went all the way to bring about a new sort of society, a workers' state. It was really a workers' and peasant state with bureaucratic distortions, but it was the first workers' state of any form that we'd had since the Paris Commune. So the reason, or the instrument, or why it was able to break through like that in Russia was because Lenin had a party, Lenin and the Bolsheviks. We should always say Lenin and the Bolsheviks. When people say Lenin this, Lenin didn't do anything on his own. He could only do anything because he had it with him and created and was part of a party, the Bolshevik party. That was the only place where there was a party of that sort, the Bolshevik party, that could bring through and have the audacity, the confidence in the politics to ensure that the revolution went all the way and a new sort of society was set up. So, to go on to today, you think, well, this happened a long while ago. But you know, the revolution in 1917, we can see the effects of it today. We have in Britain a national health service, and across Europe, there are welfare states. Why? Because after the Second World War, the rulers knew what happened at the end of the First World War. It was revolution. There was a Tory politician in Britain, Quinton Hogg, in the House of Parliament in 1943, who said, either we give them revolution, sorry, he didn't say that. He said, either we give them reform, or they will give us social revolution. And that's why when Europe was rebuilt after the war, with American money, the Marshall Plan, he said, you can have welfare state, as long as you keep the communists out. They didn't have a welfare state in America. They weren't scared of revolution. Now that welfare state that we have got, you know, obviously there's people, it wasn't only what happened in Russia, but people fought for it and wanted it here as well, with a massive post-war victory of the Labour government. But the situation we face today is that across the world, there is real economic problems. I mean, it's bad. It's just starting now. It's going to get really, really bad with inflation, with recession and everything else. We've got war. It's not quite world war, but Nancy Pelosi seems to be keen on going to Taiwan and starting one. Because not only is there Afghanistan and Ukraine, let's go to war against China as well. You know, so we're in a situation of war, but we've also got catastrophic climate change. And the realisation by more and more people today, you can't just reform it a bit. We need a real solution. And the only solution is a revolutionary solution. There's times where you could have said that, people say, we need a revolutionary. Don't be silly. People don't say don't be silly now, because they can see it's needed. But what we've also got now is February revolutions. In Sri Lanka, they had a mass uprising. They were swimming in the King's swimming pool, you know what I mean, in Sri Lanka. It was a February type revolution. What will replace it? We want another October revolution. We've also got the revolution movement in Sudan. And there are neighbourhood committees. They're not quite Soviets, but there has been and there is still going on an unfolding revolution in Sudan. So revolutionary politics, the example of the lesson of the Russian Revolution, isn't something just for historians to argue about. It's about now. Because we need, in the world today, just as they did in 1917, real, fundamental, revolutionary, world turned upside down solutions that will free not only the oppressed, but the whole of humanity. So, forward to the next October.